Hey there. We're a little bit behind this morning. I'm waiting for my guest to come on, but we're going to go ahead and start without him. Tom will be on, I'm sure, any minute. Erin is going to try to help him figure out the link. And actually, that's probably him responding right now. Nope, it's not. Okay. I'm going to turn this off. I'll introduce my guest then in just a moment. As soon as he's connected, I'll let Erin work on that. But today we're going to talk about the need for regenerative agriculture, even in gardening. And during this talk, I'm planning on walking around outside so I can show you a little bit of what I'm doing, which is, yes, Richard has to come visit at opportune moments, of course. Bye-bye, Richard. Anyway, I'm doing some interesting things around here, and I'm using some of the product that Tom's company produces. So we'll talk about what that is and what it does as soon as he's on. And in the meantime, why regenerative agriculture? I might as well just start with that, right? I grew up in Wisconsin, America's dairyland, where the landscape was dotted with small farms, and every home had a backyard garden. My mother, well, she didn't do the gardening, she did the canning, but my father and I maintained three separate gardens in two different locations, as I recall. Everybody I knew gardened, and all of the small family farms had their animals out on pasture. There was not widespread chemical use. But then fast forward to the last 30, 40, definitely 40 years, and we've seen a real change in how people grow food, whether it be a farmer or a mom with a backyard garden. We have switched to uh, highly chemical-based food production. And what does that do from the ground up? This is something that I want to address with Tom. And I'm sorry if he's I hope he makes it on. Um, Otherwise, this is a one-woman show, and I really like to interview people, so we'll hope that we connect. Um, but the point of all of that rambling is that now the small family farms are gone, and we've talked about this in past shows. But we see where the gardens are being sprayed to kill weeds and tilled as well. And the farms have become mega farms that are completely reliant upon chemicals, both for nutrients, which are actually not good quality nutrients and not full spectrum, as well as for pest and weed control. So this has meant, or this has resulted in highly toxic soils, highly toxic water, highly toxic food, and highly toxic people. One of the things that I notice about all of this is that, for instance, soil on a conventional farm, um, at the end of harvest, when the fields are dormant and the materials should be breaking down in the soil, instead, what we're seeing is plant matter just lying there dead. It doesn't biodegrade and nothing really happens. And this is because the microbes in the soil have been destroyed by the chemicals that are used to kill weeds and mold and fungus and insects. If it kills them, doesn't it mean that it's going to eventually kill us? And of course, the answer to that is yes. But it also means that plant matter cannot break down as it is designed to. And that means that there is not the nutrition going back into the soil as God intended. If those microbes are no longer viable and the plant matter is not breaking down, and then the nutrients are not going back into the soil, then we have plants that are dependent upon chemicals to grow. And they're growing on dead soil, so they're perpetually requiring chemical inputs from the farmer. I don't like to call it a farmer when they're doing things this way because this is not really farming. Um, and so we're producing food that is devoid of nutrients and highly toxic with the chemicals that have been utilized to produce it. Well, in our gardens, we're doing the same thing. And I'm going to throw in there also that tilling and plowing destroys the microbiology of the soil as well. And so if you're using a tiller in your garden, you're disrupting the microbiology of the soil. You're destroying and disturbing the very things that are needed to break down, again, plant matter and animal matter as well, to break it down to put the nutrients back into the soil. Although it's capable of doing more just from plowing and tilling than it is from being heavily sprayed. But in most cases, both things are happening. Um, I often think back on the instructions that God gave to how to grow food or the illustrations of plowing and sowing. And I've come to the conclusion that the biblical descriptions of plowing are not plowing as we plow today. Um, I think it's actually tilling, just turning over and replenishing with fresh plant matter that breaks down slowly. It's not taking a deep plow and turning over soil completely. And sowing is, people used to toss seed. So you're going to grow a field of grain, you're tossing seed to and fro. You're not disturbing the soil microbiology and plugging seeds in. You're just sowing. Well, there are a lot of advantages to that. Um, and I really feel like I'm just rambling because I did not anticipate not having my guest on. And he knows so much more about the microbiology of soil and why all of these things matter than I do. I know a lot, but I don't have all of the science behind it. But I can tell you this, I changed many years ago the way in which I grow food. So we bought a property it was 10 acres and it had been monocropped and heavily sprayed for years and years and years and years. It grew thistles and it grew obnoxious weeds like burdock and other things which are actually there for a reason. It's not that they're bad, but that soil could only grow things that had deep tap roots because the microbiology of the soil was dead and the nutrients were no longer at the surface level. And so whenever you see something like a burdock or a thistle or even a dandelion, they have long tap roots that are able to dig deep down beneath the surface of the soil, beneath the first couple of inches, so that it can draw nutrients up from a deeper level. Well, in a proper ecosystem, then that plant, it thrives during the growing season. It may give us food or medicine. And then in the fall, it's going to die off, at least in the northern hemisphere. In the fall, it's going to die off. And the microbiome of the soil, the microbiology of the soil is going to break that plant matter down. And the nutrients that came from deep within are now at the surface level. That taproot has brought nutrients from deep beneath the surface. They have built this plant. The plant has died at the end of the season, and the microbiology of the soil takes care of breaking everything down and replenishing the surface, revitalizing the surface of the soil. And so, what we did on our farmstead was instead of tilling, initially we did use a rototiller. I'll tell you that. In our garden, we did initially rototill, and then I learned better. I believe I saw the Back to Eden garden story and read some books and heard some speakers at events. And I learned that there was a better way, and I decided to give it a try. So instead of then rototilling again or plowing, what we did was we overseeded and we brought in mulch from tree trimmers. So my garden received about a 6-inch layer of mulch, and eventually I switched to straw. It could have been hay. The Ruth Stout gardening method, you can look up Ruth Stout. She wrote a couple of books. I utilized her methods, and I read the lasagna gardening book, and I kind of mixed all of this together and came up with, within a very short period of time, actually, this vibrant live soil that grew food, and lots of food. Out on the pastures, instead of plowing and planting, we overseeded one time with a mixture of herbs and grasses, and I put the cow and the calf and the horses and the chickens, they followed behind afterwards. We put all of them out and rotationally grazed. I put out free choice minerals and kelp and salt, and the animals took what they wanted, and then what they deposited behind them in the soil that was loosened with their feet, their hooves, or the scratching of the chicken's feet, that all added nutrients back into the soil, so that within a very short period of time, just 2 or 3 years, we had a property that was totally alive. We had birds, we had butterflies, and we had plants galore. Where we had once seen just thistle and burdock, we now had a multitude of grasses and herbs, and it was rich and thick and green and vibrant. We had pollinators everywhere. It was beautiful. Then in our garden every year, instead of tilling, I would just, in the spring, or in the fall rather, I would add another deep layer of mulch, either straw or tree mulch, not just the limbs, but the whole tree. You want to have mulch from trees that includes the leaves and all of that for the variety of nutrients, including carbon. And my soil, after a few short years of gardening that way, became this rich, soft, black, loose garden of life that grew anything I put into the ground, and it grew amazingly well. So I've continued to do this now that we live not on the farm, but in Virginia on a mountaintop that grows rocks. You've probably heard me say that before. I've continued using this strategy. So to begin with, a few years back, I again had tree trimming companies come up. And it so happened that one year all of our ash trees died on the mountain because of ash borer beetles. We should probably circle back to that and talking about natural predation and keeping everything in check without chemicals. But as it was, there were not a lot of natural predators, and there was an overabundance of ash borer beetles, which killed the ash trees and then started to move into the oak trees and some other trees. So there was an abundance of tree mulch, and the tree trimming and cutting companies didn't even know what to do with all of this mulch. So I had them bring several dump truck loads up to our land. It's not very much. We have 7/10 of an acre, but we had them dump big piles, and then I utilized my garden cart and a skid loader that we rented for a short time, and we moved this mulch into the backyard and across the front yard where it was just rocky and growing weeds. Now there's grass, and at the moment, the ground is covered in beautiful violets that happen to be in bloom right now, and dandelions. Then in the area where I now have my chicken coop, and the only ground-based food production that I have, it's in my lower yard right on top of where those piles had been placed. So I have to grow stuff, and my husband didn't really understand that about me, surprisingly. And so last year I had to really appeal to him and say, look, I've just got to grow stuff. I really want chickens. We were supposed to have chickens. I use them in my gardening. Can we please get chickens again?" And so he put up a fence right over where this pile was. And it was probably about 8 to 12 inches deep, not even, in the old mulch that had just sat there biodegrading. But when you add animals into the system, they do two things. They loosen the soil with their hooves or their scratching, and they fertilize with their poo. So the fence went up around that pile, and I put the chickens down there. I toss all of my food scraps out. I hate to put it in the garbage for the bear to tear into. I would much rather recycle my kitchen scraps and my garden scraps by tossing it into the chicken yard, and it goes right on top of that old mulch. The chickens scratch through it, they dig, they eat a lot of what I toss out. The rest of it biodegrades because there is a very healthy balance of microbes down there now. And of course, then it also produces worms and attracts other insects for the chickens to eat. So they get a protein-rich diet. They fertilize my garden and they loosen the soil. And they also eat some of the pests that are part of that whole system. And so in my garden in the front yard, uh, it's just beautiful. It's growing food. And actually, the funny thing is, I was throwing tomatoes out for them last year for the chickens to finish off. Well, those tomatoes self-seeded. And so last year I had a virtual tomato jungle in that chicken yard. I had sectioned off about two-thirds of it to grow food, and then the top third was just for the chickens. And then once plants grew to be strong, I would open the gate so that they can go down and eat the pests and continue to keep the nutrient level high with their poo, and while they kept the soil loose. So, I mean, I planted tomatoes last year, like maybe half a dozen. I also planted some corn and some squash, but I'm telling you, I don't know. I don't even have a guess as to how many beautiful tomatoes came out of that garden, and most of them I hadn't even planted. I had several different varieties, clear varieties. Um, it was a beautiful thing, and I'd tell the neighbors, "Please come over and pick tomatoes. I have way too many." And ditto with some of the squash. Um, so I was able to utilize food from that space quite heavily last year. I put a lot of it away for the winter. We're still eating some of that. By the way, when I don't have time, harvest. I just harvest and I throw, say, my tomatoes into the Vitamix and I whiz it up. Maybe I cook it down or maybe I don't. I just put it in containers and freeze it for later. So that's what I did last year. That's what I'll do again this year. But with all of this vibrant life and this micro system, this ecosystem that I created down there, I have just harvested an abundance. And I'm looking forward to doing the same thing this year. And by the way, at the same time, I'm getting eggs. My chickens are giving me eggs. So it's really a happy thing. I take what is waste to me and what is waste to others. I dump it in that space. I let the chickens do their work and work their magic. And out of that, I get an abundance of food for my family. Now, on our 10-acre farm, of course, I was doing this in a larger garden and I was utilizing even more animals. In the fall, when the garden was going to rest, I would typically put a cow and a calf in my garden for a day or two, and let them clean it up. When I had goats, I did the same thing. I would kind of rotate and then I'd put them back in another spot. But I utilized every animal that I had in that space to loosen the soil and fertilize the soil. And then on our lawn, we used chicken tractors and poultry netting, and we would move our meat birds across our lawn every day. They'd be on fresh soil every day, and sometimes they would get moved twice. And consequently, we had a very, very lush green lawn. And we also moved them through the orchard, which kept the orchard soil good and healthy. However, our invisible fence for our livestock guardian dog ended just in front of the orchard, which meant that you were taking a big risk. And we lost. We lost a couple of times by moving our chickens, even in poultry netting or chicken tractors into the orchard, because the livestock guardian dog couldn't or didn't go that far. She didn't reach into the orchard, and a couple of times we had a fox or coyotes or something go in there at night and haul off some of my meat birds, which is not happy. But aside from that, when we were watching and not losing livestock in the orchard also benefited along with the garden. And the pastures that we rotationally grazed were just lush with a multitude of different plants, not just Timothy hay or alfalfa. It was a lot of different herbs and grasses that were very good for the livestock that we grazed, one section at a time. This method is generally called regenerative farming and regenerative gardening. This is where and when, instead of taking nutrients out of the soil and leaving it devoid of nutrients, we're constantly replenishing the soil and adding nutrients. When we finally decided to move from our farmstead in Pennsylvania down here to Virginia, we sold it as a working organic farm. We made a good profit. The people who bought it were just thrilled. It was two sisters who bought it with their families. One was a gardener and one wanted to farm. And so they took what we had done and they were able to continue. They raised chickens, and I don't know what all they have now. I know they have donkeys and chickens, but what else they have, I don't know. But my family thrived on that land for 17 years. We always had a milk cow. We raised 1, 2, or 3 calves every year, so we had plenty of meat. We always raised broiler chickens. Sometimes we raised ducks, geese, pigs. We raised lamb a couple of times, and what else? We tried goats for a while, but we needed better fencing. We also needed to part with Psycho Goat in order to save my own sanity. But the point of that is that we utilize every bit of that farm for animal production using regenerative practices. Even the woods, we use the woods as well. That's where the goats went. Goats don't like to eat grass. They will eat grass, but they prefer to browse. Sheep eat grass. And cows and horses eat grasses. But goats like to eat brush, and so I put goats in the woods, and I would put chickens in the woods. And in the fall, I would put pigs in the woods, and they would root around and loosen the soil in the woods, looking for grubs and acorns and that kind of thing. So our entire little 10 acres became a piece of heaven, and it was just alive with birds, butterflies, moths, every kind of pollinator you can imagine. And we did not have a lot of pests because we created an environment that encouraged a balance. And this is the thing with regenerative versus conventional farming and gardening. One of the things is that when you build a proper ecosystem the way God designed things to be, you have a proper balance of predators and prey. So we had plenty of predators, and they were the correct predators we fostered that relationship so that the predators would take care of the pests. This is what doesn't make sense to me with some of the government programs with putting grizzlies and wolves back into different ecosystems where their numbers have fallen. Well, their numbers have fallen because there's less prey, and that's natural. It doesn't mean that the animals are going to die and never come back. In a proper ecosystem, you have the right ratio of predator and prey. You can build this even in your backyard garden by using regenerative practices, as I've been describing, instead of relying on chemicals. So, no glyphosate, no Roundup, no chemically based fertilizers. Just like I say that we need real food for a healthy body, we need real food for healthy soils as well, and real food for healthy animals. So we feed the microbiology of the soil to build strong and healthy plants that build strong and healthy animals, that build strong and healthy human beings, us. But when you're relying on chemicals and tilling and plowing, you're upsetting that whole microbial balance and then the predator prey balance. When you do things correctly, then your plants are actually resistant to predation, whether it be by locusts and grasshoppers or cabbage leaf moths or other things. You see, we all have an electromagnetic field. As long as we're alive, we have an electromagnetic field that our body produces. It sounds like woo-woo stuff, but it's actually literally true. That electromagnetic field grows stronger the healthier we become. When we have a very strong, healthy electromagnetic field, our bodies repel pests. So, for instance, I rarely get a tick or a mosquito bite, and yet other people I know are bothered by them constantly. Actually, even one of our kids is typically eaten by mosquitoes, and she has a good diet, but not as good as not as good maybe as it could be. Um, Plants, when they are healthy and strong, they have a strong electromagnetic field, which repels pests like grasshoppers, locusts, and moths. It's not to say that there will never be a cabbage leaf moth eating the cabbage leaves or the broccoli or whatever, but the incidence and the damage is much, much, much less because a healthy plant emits a strong electromagnetic field that repels insects. I'm going to tell you a story that a farmer told me years ago that just fascinated me. This man worked for a company that helped farmers to grow very strong and healthy plants by building healthy soils. They received a call at the office one day from one of their clients who happened to be in Iowa. Not that it matters, but he was in Iowa and he was growing, I've forgotten whether it is corn or soybeans, but he was a regular production farmer and he was using organic regenerative practices to build strong and healthy soils for strong and healthy plants. But around him, his neighbors, his I'm sorry, I just saw something really cool flying from one tree to another. Okay, back to focus. We have a very strong and healthy ecosystem right outside our door here, and there are lots of really cool animals and plants out there, and sometimes they're fun to watch. Anyway, this farmer was surrounded by conventional fields of the same crop that he was growing. So his neighbors were using chemically based agriculture for which either of these crops it was, and they were being attacked by locusts. So the farmer called up this company and said, "You've just got to come and see what's happening here." And so they actually flew down the next day to see. And here, where the locusts were devouring the surrounding crops, this man's crops were actually repelling the destructive insects. They would fly close and fly right back out. And they weren't penetrating more than a few feet before they'd fly back out, because the plants in this farmer's fields were so healthy and strong that they produced a strong electromagnetic field which repelled these insidious pests. That illustration or that example has stuck with me through the years. And as I've learned more about soil health, plant health, animal health, human health, I have understood and continue to learn more and more about how we can build a strong and healthy body ourselves that repel pests by getting lots of sunlight, by grounding, walking barefooted in the earth, on the earth. That's very important. And eating very good nutrient-dense foods, clean foods. And there's also an emotional element, which we're going to get into at a later date. I'm going to interview someone I'm acquainted with about emotional health and emotional traumas and all of that. But for now, just let's think about what we can do to build really healthy soils and healthy microenvironments, even in our own backyards. You can see behind me, actually, I love growing things. I've already said that, haven't I? I just have to grow things. So I've got a bunch of different things right here on the table behind me. I've got things all through the house growing. I'm utilizing a variety of methods that I also use outside. So I told you about my garden out front, but I really think we need to get up and look and see. So let me get up and move. You're going to see a messy house as I'm preparing to go to Mountain Readiness this weekend and teach a couple of workshops and do some other teaching. Okay. I'll just show you. Here's a snake plant. I've had it for I don't know how long, and it's doing remarkably well. I actually use some of my non-guest, my missing guest. I use his products on both my house plants and my garden plants to help the soil microbiology. But I've got a lot of different things going here. So this is just house plants, right? We still like to have healthy house plants. That's really important to many of us. But sometimes I rescue plants from near destruction, like I did my bird of paradise that's out here in my atrium. And it was actually getting attacked by spider mites, or whitefly rather. And I had to cut a couple of branches off. And I have been feeding this with Coast of Maine. It's an emulsion of seaweed and fish product. So it's extremely nutritious. It's high in nitrogen and lots of different things that the plants really need for food. And when you're growing something in a container that can't reach down into the ground, you really need this. But this bird of paradise, it hasn't bloomed for me yet, but it was actually dying. It was in a pot that was way too small, and it just simply could not survive had I not taken it and started really focusing on feeding it. So in addition to doing the seaweed and seafood emulsion, I'm using Tom's product also to help the soil microbiology and to regenerate. But I want to show you my fun thing. This is just, I don't have this going well yet. I have a lot of things planted for this year. But I do another style of gardening called hugelkultur, wherein this started and typically is done just on the surface of the ground. But I'm always questioning everything, right? And thinking outside of the box. And I thought, if you can do hugelkultur on top of the ground, certainly it works in containers as well. And so in my backyard, it's very sunny right at the moment, but I have these livestock water tanks, and I have them planted. Right now, I have them planted with potatoes, Swiss chard, and spinach, and I have one lonely asparagus. There, my spinach is coming up and doing just fine here. There's a lot more that's coming up. Actually, the Swiss chard was doing fabulously, but I had the chickens loose in the backyard for a couple of days, and they totally destroyed what I was doing. So the Swiss chard is trying to come back. I took those watering tanks and I filled them first with logs and branches and leaves from trees that had come down. And then I filled them with good, clean soil, and I topped it off with a good, heavy compost, all organic and clean. And then I watered it and I let it sit and get acclimated for a bit before I ever planted it. This will be, I think, probably my 5th summer of growing food in there. These tanks have produced an abundance of food. The potatoes are doing well right now. I'll show you those. I've got some squash planted that's starting to come up also. But each fall, I cover it again with compost or with leaves and let it break down over the winter. And, oh, I didn't tell you the middle. My middle section is for fish. And this is part of my system too. So I think I need to clean the filter, but you can see that I've got goldfish in there. I actually intended for tilapia and catfish for food. They're really expensive to ship, so I haven't done that yet. But I have goldfish in there. And the reason that I have fish in water right in the middle is I can water and feed my plants at the same time. So I have a bucket back there, and I just scoop water out of that fish tank. It's nutrient rich, and then I water with that directly onto the troughs. And consequently, I have a really nice ecosystem going, and the plants are strong and healthy. Now, I will still occasionally get cabbage moths or something. I typically use that back section for some of the brassicas as well as some of the greens, because it doesn't get full sunlight throughout the entire day. It just happens to be sunny right now. It gets a lot of shade in the morning. And so that works well for some of the brassicas. But I also rotate, because you don't want to grow the same exact thing on the same exact plot every year. If you can recall back in the Old Testament law, where God was giving the instruction for things like letting the pasture go or the field go fallow every 7 years, or there actually are very clear instructions about rotating what is grown. This is because one single plant will take certain nutrients out of the soil. If you keep using that plant in the same place each year, it's going to deplete that nutrient. So you want to rotate, and then different nutrients will be laid year after year. You rotate, then the plants grow stronger, they repel insects, and then you have much less insect damage. So that's what I do in the backyard, and things are not just perfect right here now. I've been planting, carpenter bees. But I've done the same style of hugelkultur in my containers on my deck. So my husband, instead of building a deck rail, he built me gardens. And I've got a lot of things. I actually grew lettuce all winter. I just covered that steel wire with plastic, so I had salad greens during the summer. My cat keeps climbing through these tunnels, though, and destroying some of what I've got going. But you can see I've got a good bit going here. And I just keep topping off with compost, and I use Tom's product, and I use the seaweed emulsion, the seaweed and fish emulsion about once a month to keep feeding and replenishing the soil. And this gives me really healthy, strong plants, and they don't tend to get eaten up terribly by the pests. I can pick off a few beetles or wipe off the cabbage moths. It's no big deal because there are not a lot of them. But I just keep rotating, feeding, replenishing. And on my planters, I do have to replace soil periodically because the plants literally consume soil for minerals, for food. And so I keep composting and adding very good, rich soil on top of it, including what breaks down from my garden. Or in the winter, my chickens are in a larger coop and they typically don't go out. It's large enough that they can live in it for the winter. So I clean that out, and that bedding goes directly onto the gardens. So we have even more food for microbes and for plants. I hope this is instructive for you. I hope it's I hope this is helpful. I'm so sorry that Tom must have had a technical issue. I don't know, but we'll get him on another time. I'll see if he can come on next week instead of having someone else. Actually, it would be good to continue this anyway with him and take it a step further than what I have. He can explain a lot more of the microbiology than I can. But I hope that this has given you some ideas. And if you have questions, please just ask. I'd love to be able to either answer myself or find someone to answer. I'm always striving to learn more. There's no end to it. I'll be dead when I stop learning. And I may change some of my practices eventually. I may find and learn better ways. I may try different things and see how they work. But these systems have been working tremendously well for me now for a lot of years. And so I'm just going to stick with it for now anyway. So hopefully that helps. Oh, okay. I'm just getting the message that Aaron was trying to help Tom, but it's a little bit late in the game now. So I think we'll just have him on next week. And then you have time to think of good questions. So ask questions, give us questions. Once we turn off this live stream, anything that is present here will be lost. So ask your questions either on YouTube. This will go up within minutes on YouTube, or you can send your questions to hello@godsgoodtable.com, and we'll be sure to get the answers for you next week. And thank you, Lori. I love to show people how I garden and how I grow food because I don't really know anybody else who's doing quite what I'm doing, and I get excited about it because it just works so very well that I want others to give it a try and see how it does for you as well. And I'll be taking more pictures and videos as the summer progresses. It feels like summer today, but it's only spring. So you'll be able to see what I'm doing. But right now I'm watching my sweet peas sprout up, and I know I need to put some string for them to climb upwards. My husband has built a frame above for my plants to climb. So I expect to have sweet peas very soon. I should have planted them sooner than I did, though. Okay, the fish idea, that is a good one, isn't it? I'm going to say that's a really good idea. I'm glad I thought of it. I just loved the idea of the livestock watering tanks, and we had terraced the backyard. My husband had built that nice rock wall, and I said, let me use that space for a garden. And I'd never seen anybody do this before. I'd seen people use containers, including watering troughs for gardens, but I'd never seen anybody try it the hugelkultur style. It works so well. The logs, they act as sponges to hold water and slowly release water. That's what's so cool about hugelkultur. And at the same time, it also releases nutrients. So it works and it saves you money and time because you don't have to buy a lot of soil to fill those tanks because you've got a lot of branches and logs in there. So what's not to love about that? And it works in everything. The deck plants that I showed you just a moment ago, those are all done hugelkultur style as well. So each one of these planters has, um, yes, soil, of course, but also branches. So I put small logs and branches in each section, and then I covered it with dirt and then with compost. And it's working fantastic. So it's doing well. And then over here, I have sourdough cake and sourdough sandwich loaf rising. It's probably getting a little too warm, so I'm going to put it in the house. And also beet kvass. I'm teaching a sourdough class and a fermentation class in addition to another presentation this weekend. So I'm getting all of that done so that I can pack it up and leave in the morning. Just in case you were wondering what that was on my table. Anyway, we'll come back to you next week with more. Please do come up to our turn on our I'm sorry, I'm reading the questions. Turn us on next Wednesday at 3:00 when we do hope to successfully engage with Tom. It didn't work this time, but I hope I filled up our time successfully anyway. The culture, the method that I'm using, Lori, is hugelkultur. We can put up notes about that in the show notes. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you, Carmen and Lori and others for checking in with us again. We're so happy that you do so every week. And we'll look forward to next week. Have a great week until then, and take good care.